Welcome back. And as we begin a new session, we now turn to the final of the three playwrights presented in the Harris-Platzner textbook, and that would be Sophocles right there. And I want to thank you so much for persisting with the course this far and now arriving at last to the third of our three Athenian playwrights. And this is actually getting close to the point where we'll be finishing up with the Greek literature and switching over to the Roman literature. We'll be doing that after the next session when we complete Euripides' Medea and the Medea point of view. So on your syllabus, the Sophocles handout is dated either to the first day of the fourth week of the course if you're taking the summer schedule, or it'll be 1 week after the Escala session if you're doing the school year session. So again, make sure you're oriented on your syllabus and your calendar and forums as to where you're supposed to be. Okay, so I'd like you to pause your video, please, and head off once again to your resources section on Sakai. Please locate handout number 3. This is the one on Sophocles, and again, this is the final playwright for us to present here in the Greek myth course. Please pause your video, and from resources on Sakai, open handout number 3. Okay, do you have handout number 3 open? All right then. So as we've done before, we're going to use the handout as a guide for presenting this particular playwright. And I'm going to spend some extra time in this particular presentation discussing the two plays that you read of Sophocles in your Harris-Platzner textbook, Oedipus Tyrannus. It's also called Oedipus Rex or Oedipus the King, but the proper name from the Greek is Oedipus Tyrannus and Antigone. We will discuss those after we complete Sophocles' own bio. Okay, so if you have your handout open, you may turn to the first page. And Sophocles, as you can see, is given to us with a pretty precise date of either 496 or 495 BC. That Parian marble referenced there is the same Parian marble that we described in the Aeschylus bio. That's the one taken from the island of Paros that's described to you in your Dowden textbook. That's the one that gives us a whole long list of dates, and there is a date there given to us, 496 or 5 BC, that is given to us for Sophocles. So fortunately, we have that fairly well established. And as you'll see, Sophocles was one of the oldest living ancient Greek that we have. He lived just about to the age of 90, just almost made it. And in fact, the fact that he got so old had an interesting consequence, because his son, who himself was getting up into his 70s, tried to haul Sophocles into court and have him declared incompetent to run his estate. Sophocles refuted the charges in front of the jury by reading out loud his final play, which had not yet been published, Oedipus at Colonus, unfortunately not in your textbook, but worth reading on its own. That play was so magnificent, and it in fact is, that the jury just dismissed the charges. So that's how Sophocles kept on going. But he did eventually pass away in 406 BC, having lived a very long, illustrious, and very successful life. Probably, I would say, in some ways, the most so of your three playwrights. As usual, we don't have an enormous amount of information from him, but we do know that he was treasurer of Athena in 443, 442 BC. And as we're alluding in the ancient Greek history videos, what that refers to is the treasurer of the Delian League of Athens. When all the tribute was collected in from the allies into Athens itself. And now, in the 5th century BC, the money is being kept on the Acropolis at Athens instead of its original location on the island of Delos. That's the name, Delian League. Now, when the money comes in, someone needs to calculate the tithe, 1/60th, that has to be dedicated to the goddess Athena. And that's what that position of treasurer refers to. And so Sophocles was involved in that in 443, 442 BC. We know that Sophocles was also a very important general as well as a playwright. So he, like Aeschylus, had a pronounced military career as well as a literary one. And his big accomplishment was the siege of Samos, one of the big islands in the east of the Aegean Sea, in 441 to 440 BC. That is with Pericles. The siege occurred because the island of Samos tried to revolt out of the Delian League. It was a big, important island and very difficult to bring down, but Sophocles and Pericles teamed up and were able to reduce it quite drastically in 440 BC. They actually ended up garrisoning the island and slaughtering a portion of the male population in order to really penalize this particular island quite severely for its particular revolt. So Sophocles is characterized as having been a very nice guy, but I do not think that the people of Samos would necessarily agree with that, considering the treatment that they suffered from him. Sophocles was also one of 10 advisors, you'll notice now in his 80s, in 413 BC. These are the Symbuloi. These were advisors who needed to instruct the Athenians what they needed to do with their democracy, because very serious errors made by the wild mob of the Demos had led the Athenians to make the unwise decision to attempt to conquer the entire island of Sicily, which you'll see on a map is about as large as almost all of Greece. It was a very serious mistake, and it led to the complete disaster in 413 BC, the destruction of the Athenian fleet that went out there. And so the Athenians were investigating whether something was wrong with their democracy to permit that type of mistake to occur. And Sophocles advised, together with the other advisors, that what the Athenians needed was a special council of 400 men or so to screen the legislation that would come up in front of the assembly to prevent anything as destructive as this to even be discussed before in front of the assembly and then be whipped up into enthusiasm by demagogues. It did sound like an interesting idea to have this particular extra council, and the Athenians, in fact, went so far as to set it up, but it had a very unfortunate ramification. 2 years after Sophocles advised this particular council ended up pulling off a coup in Athens, 411 BC, that ended up overthrowing the democracy for about 8 months and replacing it with a very severe and radical oligarchy. So Sophocles' advice, while well-intentioned, unfortunately did not work out well for the Athenians, as it turns out, in practice. The only other thing we know about Sophocles was that he was a priest of Asclepius and apparently had a snake at his house. That would be appropriate, obviously, for Asclepius. And so he was known to have that cult. And as we said, he finally passed away in 406 BC. Interestingly, he passed away after the playwright Euripides. And so when word of Euripides' death in Macedon came down to Athens in 406 BC, Sophocles was still alive and did in fact produce a play in 406 BC in which he dressed his chorus all up in black mourning garb in order to pay proper tribute to Euripides. So that was Sophocles' final production while he was alive, and then he passed away himself thereafter. However, that was not Sophocles' final play, as it turns out, because his play Oedipus at Colonus was produced posthumously 5 years afterwards in 401 BC. And so Sophocles ended up with a repertoire that survived him after death. Okay, and so that is information on Sophocles' bio. What we have for the works, we have over 120 plays attributed to him. And his first successful production, in fact, his first production was 468 BC. That's B on page 1 of your handout, against Aeschylus. He won first prize, and thereafter he had a really distinguished and very successful career with at least 20 victories, 18 of them at the city Dionysia, and he exclusively won either first or second prize and never came in third place. His final production was in 406 BC. So we know that Antigone did win. We know that Oedipus Colonus, which was produced in 401 BC, also won, as did another play, Philoctetes, in 409 BC. Oedipus Tyrannus, interestingly, didn't win, and we do not know exactly what date it is. We'll come to that a little bit later when we talk about the play itself. But that one, which curiously is one of the most popular of his plays today, did not end up actually winning in its day. Sophocles apparently had a relatively weak voice, and so unusually for playwrights, he did not act himself in the plays as most playwrights did. So there was a particular actor, Tlepolemus, that we have a reference to who acted in his stead. Sophocles' reputation, and this is now page 2 of the handout, was absolutely outstanding, probably the most so of our playwrights. Again, the curious thing is that he, according to Aristophanes' Frogs, he had the reputation of being a very easygoing guy. And there's a really humorous scene in this comic play, which, by the way, was in 405 BC, the year after Sophocles' death. Dionysus, the theater god, is going down into the underworld at a point when he thinks that the Athenians may be defeated in the war with Sparta, which in fact they were the following year. And he wants to rescue the theatric arts, so he goes down into the underworld to find Euripides, the playwright. In order for him to get down to the underworld, he has to find his way down there. And so he asks his half-brother Heracles to give him instructions. And Heracles is really puzzled and says, "Why do you want to go down to the underworld?" And Dionysus says, "I need to get Euripides." And Heracles says, "Euripides, that jerk, that totally awful playwright, why would you want him?" And Dionysus says, "Well, I'm absolutely in love with him. I'm besotted with him, and I need to get him back because I have to save the city of Athens so that I can be worshipped for theater." And Heracles says, "But Euripides is terrible. Why don't you get a really good playwright like Sophocles?" And Dionysus says, "Sophocles? No, Sophocles is too nice. I need a real jerk who will really spur on the Athenians. That's why I need Euripides. I need a really bad playwright who will instigate real action to happen, not this laid-back guy like Sophocles." So that's how we know that Sophocles apparently had the reputation of being really a nice guy. As I said before, though, I don't think the Samians would particularly agree with that. Anyway, so he had the reputation of being a nice guy. Okay, so one thing that's really big with him, as we've discussed with the other two playwrights, is his style, which is the middle style. This is quite fascinating, especially with Sophocles, in the way that he characterizes both the men and gods. Middle style, obviously in between high and low, is indeed a kind of halfway point between the two. Recall that with Euripides, low style is all humans are awful, and we depict exactly what's going on with them and with all their warts and imperfections right out there in front for everybody to see. High style, which is Aeschylus, is the epic version, which says that gods and fate are in complete command of what goes on with human affairs, and humans really don't have much say about what goes on. They're basically pawns on a chess game, and they just simply go forward to their fate without much say. So those are the two extremes. So Sophocles, of course, has a middle version. What this is that men are influenced by gods, to be sure. However, the humans in these plays are depicted as the ideal that they ought to aspire to. So it's humans not exactly as they are, the way that Euripides does it, but as they ought to be. And that means that the humans have the potential to transcend the limits placed on them by the immortals to a certain extent. So in that sense, they're not completely pawns of the gods and fate as is depicted in Aeschylus. They do have free will to a certain extent. They cannot, however, escape their fate, as in fact we see quite dramatically depicted with Oedipus and Oedipus Tyrannus. So in that sense, what we have is the depiction of humans in the middle of some really awful calamity that they can do nothing about, needing to strive past their inner boundaries to cope with that awful tragedy. And it's the capacity for humans to learn how to cope and strive past the limits that they thought they had. That is what ennobles the tragedy in Sophocles. So that's what the middle style refers to. Okay, Sophocles is really theatric with his plays, with a great deal of metaphors and a lot more drama with the exits and entrances of the different characters. And there's a lot more now with space and location, a lot more geography described than is the case with Aeschylus. Interestingly, Sophocles in his play Philoctetes has Philoctetes abandoned on the island of Lemnos, and he treats the island as if it's a totally deserted, desolate island, despite the fact that he, just like everybody else, knew perfectly well that Lemnos was a fully developed polis with a population. So it's curious that Sophocles chooses to depict Lemnos this way, as this desolate island, almost like a pre-civilization island, for the exile of Philoctetes. But Sophocles in general puts a lot more drama and suspense, especially in his plays, especially with the way, again, that the characters go in and out quite frequently. And a particular object, like the bow of Philoctetes, the one that he got from Heracles when Heracles was burned on the pyre after the whole incident with the Nessus and the robe and such, received this bow, and that bow can shoot unerringly, and it allowed Philoctetes to survive on the island of Lemnos when he was exiled there. The difficulty, however, is that it turns out that that bow is needed for conquering the Trojans in the Trojan War. An oracle tells the Greeks this. So Odysseus goes in the play to island of Lemnos to trick Philoctetes into getting back over to the Trojan War with the bow. And of course, Philoctetes won't go. He can't stand Odysseus because Odysseus was the one responsible for Philoctetes' exile. And so the exile happened, by the way, because Philoctetes was stung by a snake, and that sting was smelling and was causing Philoctetes to screech constantly, and so he couldn't serve at Troy because of all the yelling and screaming, and that's why he was dispatched over to the island of Lemnos, and he's furious at Odysseus for being treated that way. So the drama of how Odysseus and Neoptolemus, the son of Achilles, have to work together very reluctantly to trick Philoctetes is how that play is carried out, and it all is hinged on that bow, and that's why that's a really significant object. Okay, so these plays again did have a repertoire, probably the most so among the three playwrights, and they all, of course, continue to be performed today. You have the list of them there, including the date for Philoctetes 409 BC and Oedipus at Colonus 401 BC. That's given to you at H at the very bottom of your handout. Okay, so that's the basic information on the playwright Sophocles. We're now going to do a companion video in which we're going to talk about the two plays that you read, Oedipus, Tyrannos, and Antigone. As I say, they both deserve some special attention, and these also might be helpful for your character presentation for Sophocles. Okay, so come on right back, and we'll discuss Oedipus, Tyrannos, and Antigone.